Picture Beverly Hills in July 1966. America was watching the Vietnam War escalate while a new generation challenged every tradition their parents held sacred. In this atmosphere of cultural upheaval, Frank Sinatra, now 50 years old and arguably the most powerful entertainer in the world, was about to make a decision that would expose the deepest contradiction in his nature. Tonight, we explore how a marriage born from passion would collapse under the weight of two irreconcilable worldviews, leaving both hearts shattered in ways that neither fame nor youth could heal. To understand what happened between Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow, one must first comprehend the extraordinary circumstances that brought together two people separated not merely by 29 years, but by entirely different centuries of thinking. Frank Sinatra in 1966 was a man who had conquered every mountain American entertainment could offer. He had survived career death and resurrection, conquered Hollywood, commanded the respect of presidents and gangsters alike, and built an empire that stretched from Las Vegas casinos to recording studios to film lots. At 50, he represented the absolute pinnacle of a certain kind of American masculinity. Controlled, powerful, and accustomed to having every aspect of his world bend to his will. Mia Farrow, at 21, embodied something entirely different. Born into Hollywood royalty as the daughter of director John Farrow and actress Maureen O'Sullivan, she had grown up surrounded by the old studio system that had shaped Frank's early career. Yet by the mid-1960s, she represented the vanguard of a new artistic sensibility. Her breakout role on the television series Peyton Place had established her not as a traditional Hollywood beauty, but as something more ethereal and mysterious. She was drawn to method acting, to artistic authenticity, to the kind of creative expression that prioritized truth over commercial appeal. Where Frank controlled every element of his performances with military precision, Mia sought to lose herself in her characters. The attraction between them was immediate, and to many observers, completely inexplicable. They had first encountered each other at a party in early 1965, where Frank had been struck not by her beauty, though she was certainly beautiful in her delicate, otherworldly way, but by her complete indifference to his legendary status. She spoke to him as simply another person at a gathering, neither intimidated by his power, nor particularly impressed by his achievements. For a man who had spent decades having every conversation shaped by others' awareness of his enormous influence, this treatment was both refreshing and irresistibly intriguing. Mia, for her part, found herself drawn to Frank's old-world sophistication and the stories he could tell of a Hollywood that was rapidly disappearing. He represented a link to the golden age that her parents had lived through, but he also possessed a vulnerability that his public persona carefully concealed. In quiet moments, she glimpsed the man behind the chairman of the board, someone who, despite all his success, remained haunted by old heartbreaks and driven by an almost desperate need for authentic connection. Their courtship unfolded against the backdrop of a rapidly changing America. As civil rights demonstrations filled television screens and young people began questioning every assumption their elders had taken for granted, Frank and Mia conducted their relationship in a strange bubble of luxury and isolation. He would send his private jet to collect her for dinner dates in New York or Las Vegas. She would join him at recording sessions, watching with fascination as he wielded his perfectionist control over every element of the musical process. He introduced her to a world of private clubs, five-star restaurants, and exclusive gatherings where power brokers from entertainment, politics, and business gathered to shape American culture. The age difference that would later become a source of such pain initially seemed almost irrelevant. Frank was 50 years old but possessed the energy and dynamism of a much younger man. His discipline regarding health and fitness meant he could match the stamina of someone half his age. Mia, meanwhile, possessed an old soul that made her seem wise beyond her years. They could spend hours in conversation about literature, philosophy, and art, finding common ground in their shared appreciation for beauty and meaning. As 1965 progressed into 1966, the intensity of their connection deepened. Frank found himself experiencing emotions he had not felt since the devastating end of his marriage to Ava Gardner more than a decade earlier. Here was someone who could challenge his intellect while appreciating his achievements, someone young enough to represent hope and possibility, but sophisticated enough to understand the complexities of his life and career. Mia represented not just a lover, but a chance at redemption from the loneliness that had haunted him through his rise to unprecedented power. For Mia, Frank offered security and worldly experience, but more importantly, he provided access to a level of artistic and cultural sophistication that few people her age could match. He was friends with the greatest musicians, writers, and filmmakers of the era. Through him, she could learn not just about entertainment as business, but about entertainment as art form. His standards were impossibly high, his taste impeccable, and his knowledge of the industry encyclopedic. By the spring of 1967, marriage seemed not just possible but inevitable. Frank had learned from the disasters of his previous marriages that success required not just passion, but compatibility of values and goals. Mia appeared to appreciate the finer things in life that his wealth could provide, while also possessing the intelligence and artistic sensibility to be more than merely decorative. She could be his partner not just in love, but in building a legacy that would transcend mere entertainment. The wedding, when it finally took place on July 19, 1966, was conducted with characteristic Sinatra efficiency and privacy. They married at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas, with only a handful of close friends in attendance. Frank wore a dark business suit rather than formal wedding attire, while Mia chose a simple yellow dress that emphasized her youth and freshness. The ceremony itself lasted only minutes, but the photographs captured something remarkable. Two people who appeared genuinely happy and optimistic about their future together. What neither of them could have anticipated was how quickly the fundamental differences in their worldviews would manifest once they began living as husband and wife. Frank's approach to marriage, like his approach to everything else, was based on control and clearly defined roles. He had built his life around the assumption that love meant protection, that his responsibility was to provide luxury and security, while his partner's responsibility was to provide emotional support and companionship within the framework he established. Maya's generation, however, had begun questioning those exact assumptions. She had come of age during the early days of what would become the women's liberation movement, though she might not have articulated it in those terms. Her understanding of marriage was as a partnership between equals, where each person maintained their individual identity and pursued their personal artistic goals while sharing a life together. She expected to continue developing her acting career, to take on challenging roles that would stretch her abilities, to grow as an artist and as a person. The crisis came sooner than anyone could have predicted, but when it arrived, it illuminated every fundamental incompatibility in their relationship with harsh, unforgiving clarity. In the fall of 1966, just months after their wedding, Mia was offered a role that would change not only her career, but her entire understanding of herself as an artist. Roman Polanski, the brilliant and controversial Polish director, was preparing to film Rosemary's Baby, and he wanted Mia for the title role. The part was unlike anything she had done before. Where her previous work had emphasized her ethereal beauty and gentle nature, Rosemary's Baby would require her to portray psychological terror, descent into madness, and ultimately a kind of maternal horror that would challenge every assumption about femininity and motherhood. It was exactly the kind of role that serious actresses dreamed of: complex, demanding, and virtually guaranteed to establish her as more than just another pretty face in Hollywood. From an artistic standpoint, the decision was obvious. This was the opportunity Mia had been preparing for throughout her young career. Roman Polanski was recognized as one of the most innovative filmmakers working, and Rosemary's Baby would give her the chance to work with the best technical crew in Hollywood while exploring psychological depths she had never before accessed as a performer. From Frank's perspective, however, the project represented everything he found problematic about the new Hollywood. The script dealt with Satanism, pregnancy, and psychological manipulation, themes he considered unwholesome and potentially damaging to Mia's reputation. The filming schedule would keep her away from home for months, disrupting the domestic stability he considered essential to a successful marriage. Most importantly, the role would require her to work with a director known for his demanding, intensive approach to filmmaking, an approach that Frank saw as inconsistent with the respect and deference he believed his wife deserved. The arguments that followed revealed the depth of their fundamental incompatibility. Frank argued from a position of experience and pragmatism. He had seen countless careers destroyed by poor choices, had watched talented people make decisions that seemed artistically interesting, but proved professionally devastating. His success had been built on careful calculation, on understanding the business implications of every creative choice. From his perspective, he was trying to protect Mia from making a mistake that could damage her long-term prospects. Mia argued from a position of artistic integrity and personal autonomy. She had not married Frank to abandon her career, but to build a life that included both love and professional fulfillment. The role in Rosemary's Baby represented exactly the kind of challenging work she hoped to do, and she could not understand how Frank could ask her to sacrifice her artistic growth for the sake of his personal comfort. As the debates continued through the fall and winter of 1966, both of them began to recognize that this was about much more than a single film role. Frank's perfectionist nature, which had served him so well in his career, made it impossible for him to accept a situation he could not control. He had assumed that marriage would bring Mia fully into his world, where his experience and judgment would naturally guide their major decisions. The discovery that she maintained independent ambitions that might conflict with his preferences felt like a betrayal of the partnership he thought they had established. Mia's realization was equally devastating. She had fallen in love, not just with Frank the man, but with the idea of being taken seriously by someone whose artistic standards were legendary. To discover that those same standards would be used to limit rather than encourage her own artistic development felt like a fundamental deception. She had expected to be his partner and equal, not his beautiful accessory. The breaking point came in the summer of 1967, as Mia was deep into filming Rosemary's Baby, and Frank was preparing for a major concert tour. The physical separation was difficult enough, but the emotional distance had become unbridgeable. Phone conversations that had once been filled with intimate sharing had become tense negotiations about schedules and obligations. When they were together, every interaction seemed to highlight their different priorities and expectations. The final confrontation occurred on the set of Rosemary's Baby itself, in a scene that would become legendary in Hollywood circles for its brutal efficiency and devastating emotional impact. Frank arrived unannounced at the Paramount Studios, carrying with him a manila envelope that contained divorce papers already prepared by his attorneys. He found Mia in her dressing room, still in costume from the day's filming, studying her lines for the next day's work. According to witness accounts, the conversation was brief and conducted with the kind of controlled intensity that Frank brought to his most difficult business negotiations. He reportedly told her that he could no longer accept the competing demands on her attention, that marriage required prioritization he felt she was unwilling or unable to provide. Mia, according to those present, listened in stunned silence as Frank explained that he had already initiated divorce proceedings, that the papers required only her signature to make their separation official. What made the moment particularly devastating was not just the suddenness of Frank's decision, but the recognition that both of them had been right about what they wanted and needed, making their incompatibility not a failure of character, but a tragedy of circumstances. Frank genuinely believed that love required the kind of total commitment that precluded competing loyalties. Mia genuinely believed that love should encourage rather than constrain individual growth and artistic development. The divorce was finalized with the same efficiency that had characterized their marriage, but the emotional aftermath lasted much longer for both of them. Frank retreated into the kind of controlled isolation that had served him through previous romantic disasters, throwing himself into his work with renewed intensity while carefully avoiding any public discussion of the relationship's failure. He had learned from the Ava Gardner experience that publicly processing heartbreak only made the pain more acute and longer lasting. Mia completed Rosemary's Baby with a performance that established her as one of the most promising actresses of her generation. But the professional triumph was overshadowed by the personal devastation of recognizing how completely she had misjudged what Frank expected from marriage. She had assumed that someone with his artistic sophistication would naturally support her creative ambitions, only to discover that his sophistication was matched by equally strong traditional expectations about domestic life. Years later, both of them would speak with surprising fondness about the relationship, acknowledging that their brief marriage had been built on genuine affection and mutual respect. Even though it had been doomed by irreconcilable differences in their fundamental assumptions about love, commitment, and personal fulfillment. Frank would describe Mia as one of the most intelligent and talented people he had ever known, while expressing regret that their age difference had made it impossible for them to find common ground about the future. Mia would remember Frank as someone who had taught her invaluable lessons about professionalism and artistic standards, while acknowledging that she had been too young to understand the depth of compromise that marriage to someone of his stature would require. The story of Frank Sinatra and Mia Farrow remains one of the most poignant examples of how love alone cannot bridge certain fundamental differences in worldview and expectations. Both of them had entered the marriage with sincere intentions and genuine affection, but neither had fully understood how their different generational perspectives would make compromise impossible rather than merely difficult. Frank's powerful need for control, which had enabled his extraordinary success, made him unable to accept a wife who maintained independent ambitions. Mia's determination to grow as an artist, which would fuel her distinguished career, made her unable to subordinate her professional development to her husband's preferences. In the end, their brief marriage served as a preview of the cultural conflicts that would define the late 1960s, as traditional expectations about relationships and gender roles came into direct conflict with emerging ideas about individual autonomy and self-determination. Frank and Mia had loved each other across a generational divide that proved unbridgeable, leaving both of them wiser but sadder about the limitations that age, experience, and differing values can place on even the most sincere romantic connections.